an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we are. It is the 6th day of October. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here, Story Studio Network. Joined by Keith Leslie. You see and hear him on CH Television, talking about all things political at Queen's Park. And John Wright is here from Maru Public Opinion. And you guys got plans for the long holiday weekend? Anything exciting, John?
From a polling point of view, I released a new poll on Thanksgiving and how we're getting together. So what I noticed about it, now 75% of Canadians actually celebrate Thanksgiving, and we have the most Thanksgiving celebrators in Ontario. But the other part of the poll was interesting because 54% of the people across the country and slightly more in Ontario are actually on the move to go to Thanksgiving dinner or having people in because they're hosting it. And I thought that was an interesting signal that the pandemic is pretty much done. Like, I mean, we hear about, right, all these, we've got friends who've got COVID now during this wave and things like that. But I thought this was really interesting. It's a kind of a return. We get, a majority, half of the country. A lot of young people clearly getting put in the back of the car to pull along with them, so they kind of pump up the numbers. But a very interesting thing where you've got all of Thanksgiving coming together. And as such, we have friends coming over tomorrow night for Thanksgiving dinner. And then we're off to our brother's house where the whole family will be gathering. So we take on both parts of the poll, but that's kind of our thing for this weekend. We're just kind of having family and friends together and nothing much else.
Yeah, well, but Keith, it's funny how, and I think to John's point, psychologically, I'm getting this sort of sense of, I'm about ready for a long weekend from a lot of people heading into the autumn.
It would be. We're a slightly different take here. I am going to be hosting my brother and his wife on Thanksgiving on Monday, but it'll be the first time we've seen them in over 2 weeks because they both came down with corona. And had it lasted like over a couple of weeks of the fatigue and the fog and just no energy whatsoever. So I haven't seen him in over 2 weeks, which is rare. We're usually getting together 3-4 times a week. We do a lot of things together. Not at all. But we are still planning to have the Thanksgiving dinner. They're over. They've been testing negative for a while now, even though they're still a bit fatigued and they're getting set to return to work. But it's brought it back in mind to me. I had some concert tickets for next week, the week after, and I'm a little leery about going into that crowd, just because my brother, we know he zipped up to Toronto for 3 Jays games and a concert and a couple of restaurant dinners and came home and boom. It's the crowds. I'm not saying it's Toronto, it's the crowds. Yeah. It's the people. So I'm still a bit leery of that, but I'm not leery of having my brother and his wife over for Thanksgiving. And I think that, we're at that stage where it's going to be an annual thing, I think, where there's going to be a bit of peak each fall and you're going to either get your shot or not get your shot. I'm lined up to get my super high dose flu shot later today, but they're not giving the COVID shots just yet. But I think it's going to be the same thing. Do you want a flu shot this year? Do you want a COVID shot this year? It's going to be around, and I think that's where we're at with it. It's around. It seems to be hitting people a bit harder this time. I don't know if it's a particular strain. It seems to be lasting, but I'm hearing anecdotally from other people as well. But it's not the hospitalizations, the numbers, the public health units aren't panicking in any way. They're just saying, hey, it's getting that time. Some hospitals are going to tell you to mask up. Some long-term care homes, do what they ask, please. And I think that's where we're going to be probably every fall for perhaps the foreseeable future.
To your point, I flew to Ottawa twice in the last 10 days, up and back, of course. And I was one of 2 people on a packed plane each time that was just wearing a mask. So there's this sense that even when you're hearing it's in a crowd and that it's around, people are just very casual nowadays. Like you don't see it. You see some people at a grocery store and, flying in a plane and stuff like that. So I just took the precaution to wear a mask, and I was only one of 2 on this flight doing so. So we are pretty casual. We're pretty relaxed about it. We do treat it probably more of a bad flu that you might get.
Well, it occurred to us when we were in Europe, especially in Italy, there was more mask wearing than I would have expected. But then I recalled that Italy was sort of ground zero for the worst doses in the first wave. So our collective memory of how all this is played out, I think, is really does play into our behaviors. We're watching the latest season of The Morning Show on Apple TV, and it's a really good show. Except I find myself being triggered because they're going back to March of 2020, and that moment when
March
the
11th.
pandemic was declared and when lockdowns were happening, and masks or no masks. Somebody, you say now, well, your brother got COVID. Okay. If you had said that back in March of 2020, your hair would have been on fire, right? I mean, and it was funny how both my wife and I are having these panic attacks while we're watching this show, because it just brought to the surface how, deeply we were affected by it. And I think there's a bit of trauma built in still there, right?
I know we're not on the Ontario politics stuff, and I think I would avoid a spa. There's a lead in for you to go in for COVID. But I gave the keynote speech to the Convenience Industry Association in Montreal. That's one of the other places I flew, and I talked about, and then we engaged in this thing that March the 11th was the night that the NBA stopped. And that's where I remember it beginning. Yeah. And I did what we have talked about on this podcast. And then I did kind of the beginning of the pandemic and went through our R's, the response to it, all the way through to the reckoning. And the reckoning was incredible, where now you've got all these facts. I mean, it's not just deficits, but I mean, you have 24% of people working somewhat or very much from home. Like you've got 14% hybrid, and then you've got 10% solid. You've got the cores of the cities that are hollowed out across the country, except, Calgary may be buoyant, but you have such incredible differences, both in terms of housing costs now and wages and savings, which were up to 30% during the pandemic. And now they're back down to 5%. That's the air going out of the balloon, so that we've spent all this money. So, I mean, the world has changed remarkably. And you're right. I don't remember the daily newscast of Doug Ford and Christine Elliott. Like, it doesn't factor into my mind until you mention it, and it's like a bad dream that suddenly comes back. Yeah. But the consequences of all of that, we're still seeing playing out. And I do an economic report every month for Maru on public opinion, which in fact comes out on Tuesday next week. It is unbelievably bad of how we think about the economy. Like, we are at the stage that it's higher than any time I've ever seen it, ever. And I don't know whether it's a proxy for Trudeau as well, because the numbers that are such that, you've got 70% who won't vote for the Liberals at the moment, and we're up to 70% who say that the economy is not on the right track. I've never seen it that high. But these are all the consequences coming forward, where, when people are going to be renewing their mortgages, and it's going to be bloodbath out there. Do you know we had 180,000 bankruptcies in the last year, which is up 22% over the previous year? I mean, this is kind of the reckoning that we've talked about. So COVID, in a way, is still around and going to be around for quite a while in, a whole bunch of other ways.
And kind of lends us into a whole new version of that sort of lingering trauma that we're going to see. It's interesting, though, and I realize there's stuff we do want to talk about at Queen's Park, but this does kind of hang over everything that we're going to talk about around Queen's Park, Keith, and that is whether the economy's clipping along at a good pace or not. Whether I know jobless numbers are going to be coming out this morning. I haven't seen them yet, but even last month they exceeded expectation. We created more jobs. The quality of the job, the payment of the job, all those are factors. But the question then, and to John's point, becomes we struggle now with our perception of how badly things are going as opposed to the reality of how well they are doing. And that can be probably more damaging. We could go into recession just by saying it out loud. I'm overstating it, but you know what I mean.
Self-fulfilling prophecies. We've often been warned about that. And the economy is one that's particularly sensitive to that kind of thinking. I read this week, and this is just another add-on statistic to that kind of doom and gloom feeling about the economy. 20% of mortgages held by the largest banks in Canada are not covering their interest rates, let alone paying the mortgage. They're reverse, or is that what they call it? It's an upside. They're not even covering the interest. So when they go to renew, they're screwed. They might not even be able to afford to renew. So that alone, to hear that kind of a figure, 20%, as John was saying, 70% of people think the economy is not on the right track. A lot of that could be anti-Trudeau sentiment. I mean, if you're going for a fourth term, you're not having people on your side. It's clear, it's obvious. But the cost of living, okay, the general figure is coming down. Well, the cost of groceries isn't as yet. They're going to freeze them. Well, they're going to freeze them at pretty high rates. And they're only freezing some things. This is not good. People are afraid to go to the grocery store. They're afraid to fill up, even if it does go down a few pennies and come back up again. It's these everyday costs are hitting people hard, really hard. And they're generating a lot of anger about the people in the economy that seem to be doing really, really well. And when you hear stories about, Shoppers Drug Mart and how well and their profits, they own the grocery stores, how much they're doing there, and yet they won't allow Dollarama to sell bread in any stores where they happen to be the landlord, and they're the landlord in an awful lot of stores. They're reducing competition on bread, for goodness sakes, when they've already been accused of fixing prices on that and convicted of it. These kind of things drive people nuts, and they see it every day. And they see the government, they hear something like the government's going to spend $500 million to build an underground parking garage at Ontario Place and give this Austrian company a 95-year lease that we're never going to see the details of, or maybe we will someday, but we're certainly going to see them before the deal's closed. And they're going to cut down 800 trees to do it.
Trees, yeah.
Then they're going to plant some trees on the roof of a place that we can walk up on top of and look out if we want. Good God. I mean, one of the funniest things I saw this week was a online post from Davy Tree Company saying, Hey, we're not going to cut down those. We're not bidding on that. Don't take. Here's a tree company, an arborist company that is reading the room better than the progressive conservatives, than the government. We had Premier Ford this week in his fireside chat about the Ontario Place thing. Well, of course, bold thinking, as he describes it, always invites criticism. This is not bold thinking. It's ridiculous thinking to put a spa there. I thought the mayor offered a pretty good solution of putting it across the street at Exhibition Place. Makes a lot more sense, and keep the park. The government's position that there's nobody going to Ontario Place, 2.9 million people. And when all this renovation is done, you're expecting 6 million. So you're going to spend all this money, 95-year lease to double the population. You make it a proper park, put grass and trees in the rest of the parking areas there, make it a real actual park. You'll have 6 million people there, and you can go to the Therme Spa across the street or somewhere else. It's just so far off the beam for the Tories to be sticking to this, especially in this economic time. It just seems, again, you're favoring someone that's a backroom deal. We have no details. It looks just like the Greenbelt stuff with all these Mr. X's getting backroom deals, or requesting stuff that politicians and their civil servants are saying, no, you shouldn't be doing this, and they're doing it anyway. All of this compounds into people feeling the economy is going the wrong way, and that the government is in it for themselves and their donors and their friends, not in it for everyday people.
Well, let me just ask you a question then based on that, John, because, in the background, very quietly, the mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, has been working the rooms, meeting with the premier, meeting with the folks in Ottawa. There has not been a whole lot of hair on fire around those conversations. In fact, she talked her way into an agreement with Doug Ford in terms of their relationship in Toronto and the province, and now is using that to leverage a conversation with the feds. For all of Doug Ford's warning that this was going to be a complete disaster if Olivia Chow was elected mayor, and I'll go on the record and admit I was out front saying, not sure she's what Toronto needs right now, but she's proving to be perhaps what Toronto needs right now, and that is a quiet, calm voice, to Keith's point, with some reasonable solutions to some of these questions, particularly around what to do on the waterfront.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are surprised because when she was elected, I mean, you always have a team that elects you and then they go to City Hall with you. And the team has been around for a while, and it's been a very left right-wing team, of course, and they took an agenda to City Hall. And I think the sense was that agenda was going to play very highly. I mean, it represented a different view of the city. It was kind of the underprivileged versus the privileged, and that was it. And I think a lot of people thought that there was going to be a bigger voice, a more strident voice because of that, both at City Hall and Ontario. I have to admit that the only thing I said at the time, because I didn't know what Olivia Chow would do, but I thought the staff who you bring actually bring a lot more to the party than just the leader. And I think they've played this really well. I don't think it solved anything that we have in the city. I mean, let's be clear. She hasn't got an agreement really on anything. We've got now reports saying the TTC has to buy a whole bunch of new, trains and things for the TTC, and it's going to cost billions of dollars. Well, I don't know where that's going to come from. We still have a deficit, so I don't know where that's going to be filled up. We've got polite talk. We've got a whole bunch of other things in the city that are not happening. I was in the core of the city 2 nights ago, and it's the first time I was actually shocked for the first time in being in this city for the last 40 years to see the amount of individual tents that have gone up in certain cities where people are living. I mean, look, I go all over the city all the time, but it was nighttime and I was down in a part of the city that I normally go to and is fine. And I looked over out of the window of my car to the left, and it was a huge amount of people who were trying to just get shelter and sleep. These are very visible things in the city. And Doug Ford lives here. Krista Freeland lives right downtown. She lives in a very Tony part of town. But she lives downtown, and you can't mistake seeing it. So I think Olivia Chow's got a voice to the table, and it's a calm voice, as you said, but there's no there yet. And I don't know how long that's going to take to do.
Well, I just think that to some degree, her tone and approach, Keith, have probably emphasized and highlighted more, back to your point, this tone-deaf approach, not just with the province, but with the feds. Oh, to be looking at what's going on here, to say, what's happening in the largest city in the country, that they are not paying attention to it, that they're not acknowledging the fact that there are real kitchen table issues here that are, distressing families, that they're, the number of around bankruptcies is one thing. The pressures on small business, like, we're not talking about any of that stuff.
I will admit that I thought that when Olivia Chow won, that one of her biggest priorities would be to have more bike lanes to safe injection sites, and instead she just she let all that slide, and as you said, went for Queen's Park, then went to Parliament Hill, had a nice quiet meeting, see what she can achieve, laying out the problems very clearly, very succinctly, and as you say, without setting anybody's hair on fire, just going in and politely doing it. We've got some major asks here. We've got some major decisions. We're going to need other levels of government. I thought her best move, it was a very symbolic thing, a very, very slight but minor move, way back last month when she announced, okay, we're going to keep the pools open because of the heat's staying on. And then she got in the swimming suit and climbed into that pool. That was a wonderful shot. And it really was. It just said, here's a priority. I'm going to get the kids in the pool for an extra month. That alone, right there, is just sort of everyone is kicking. Let's take a breath. There's nothing wrong with that kind of priority, is there? And see how she and so as to your point, this quiet diplomacy that she's acting out. Everyone knows the city's got some serious financial problems and is going to need other levels of government. Is somehow structure things differently, whether it's the highways going back to the province or the feds coming up with some sort of special thing for the largest city in the country. I don't know, but it's going to require new approaches. And she's shown she can work with Doug Ford, who, said some really nasty things about her on the way in, as did a lot of other people. And she's just letting all that go and just getting on with the job quietly. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. And it will send the message that at least someone is looking out for ordinary, everyday people here.
Well, we'll get a sense of that, John, I think, in about a month or so, once they start seriously talking about the budget numbers for Toronto. We know what the big nut is, but the question is the how-tos and what are we going to do to make sure all of this sort of plays out. So it'll be curious to see how much of that conversation with the province and with the feds becomes more animated as we get into the more serious, boots on the ground conversation around budgets for next year.
Yeah, but I think there's two different leverage points here, and a real problem. So the leverage points are that Doug Ford wants Ontario Place, and he wants a couple of other things to happen. And we've just seen with the Greenbelt that you can actually move them off of those sort of things. And there are some parallels here where there's kind of an autocratic approach to putting things in place, and then there's a rebellion against it. And all those people that like to rebel, plus others who support Ontario Place and will be there to now shift over with the NDP and move forward on that front. And we're seeing it already. But the federal government is another interesting play here, where we've got a new Treasury Board minister who's gone looking to save $15 billion out of the government that is $1 trillion in debt right now. And it's in, they're spending as much, I think, what is the debt interest charge rate now? It's like $40 billion a year or something like that. It's incredible how much we would be spending on other things. The problem that we have is interesting. We have a federal government who's been spending money like you wouldn't believe for the last 7 years. So, whatever problem, forget about it. It's always that phrase that was first used at Queen's Park that I heard. And it was kind of like, the percentage of debt to GDP, don't worry about it. It's like, holy crap. I mean, it's so huge. And so now you've got them pulling back with $15 billion. I mean, there's floating the ideas that $1 billion is going to come out of defense. Well, it's more than a float. I can tell you that. From the inside, they're already looking at every program that they could cut from the military. So now you've got this austerity going at a party federally that's 27% in the polls, that needs Toronto desperately, and the Maritimes. Boy, the Maritimes, it's gone. Carbon taxes just killed them out there. But they need these areas, but they're in a constraint mode. So how do you offset that by saying, okay, well, we're going to give $500 million to match whatever Ontario does for Toronto? And then somebody else across the country puts up their hand. Ottawa puts up their hand. Hey, we need money too. Like there's an issue here structurally that I think does fall back to the province more than it will be for the feds. And that's where you get into everything from TTC to raising revenue off of tolls on highways to a bunch of other things. So maybe as I said, the quiet voice was necessary to develop the relationships, but the penny has not dropped anywhere. And I think, the question will be, do we have to wait to the spring until we get the budgets, of the provincial government? When are our taxes going to go up? And that's another penny that may drop, at the beginning of the year. So it's a very interesting conundrum. Nice, quiet voice, but where's the stick? I mean, and I mean stick in terms of making sticking stuff, but also this, something to bludgeon with. It's not there yet. So there's still a long way to go.
Lots to watch. Want to just, we had all the fire and brimstone around the Greenbelt last week, Keith, when the Premier said, I'm showing leadership by backing out of this deal. We know that the legislation is going to be introduced, I guess, the 16th of October. And that should be pretty much a summary affair. I don't imagine there'll be a whole lot of conversation or issue around that. But something, all the stuff in the weeds around this thing is still problematic. And, we haven't talked a lot about it, but the whole idea that they were changing the boundaries, for example, for municipalities to take in some of this farmland so that the municipalities could actually, manage the housing requirements. And I know, Hamilton, for example, says you don't have to do that here, but they insist that that's got to be part of the plan. So it's still a little murky.
Well, it's getting a little bit clearer, and as the opposition is now calling it Greenbelt 2.0, and it kind of looks that way. What we've got here is on the same day that the Ford government took those lands out of the Greenbelt last November, on that same day, they forced boundary expansions on Hamilton, Ottawa, Waterloo, several other communities. Hamilton and Ottawa in particular were not happy about this. And in fact, the City of Hamilton Council had a vote. We don't need to expand within our boundaries. We've got more than enough land. Then the NDP got hold of a leaked memo, and the Narwhal dug even further into this. And it turns out that in this Hamilton boundary expansion, there was all these third-party requests. We don't know who these third parties were, but they were developers and speculators, land speculators. They'd made these requests, And all of a sudden, this land is put in against the city's objections, against the warnings of the civil servants who said it's not going to meet your environmental needs. You're not consulting with the First Nations who all said they're opposed to this. And oh, by the way, it's 90% prime farmland again. The city doesn't need it. They need the land for farmland. They don't need it as part of its municipal boundaries. Same with Ottawa. They're expanding out 22 kilometers. It just didn't seem to make sense, but some developers getting rightly enriched by, or not rightly, getting very enriched by this. So what is going on here? This is not going to put the Greenbelt scandal behind them. When the legislature's off this week, so it's going to give everybody, the journalists, the opposition parties, another week to dig in even further on these boundary expansions. There's been court challenges to some of them, and that's why we're getting documents coming out of there. The Narwhals yesterday, I was shocked. They had a 16-minute read on this thing. They really went to town on this. There's a lot in here that just smells as bad as the original Greenbelt thing did. So when Ford and that legislation that's coming on the 16th, when Ford promised he would, put all those lands back into the Greenbelt and expand a bit more, they're not putting back these boundary expansions in Hamilton, Ottawa, and the other communities. They're not doing that. So that just, again, it smells to high heaven of backroom deals, of more Mr. X's lobbying and getting what they want through the government, through some sort of secretive process, bypassing the municipal councils and the local residents. I mean, it just seems absurd, but it's going to be just as bad as the original Greenbelt scandal if they don't move quickly to at least justify the reasons why they did this and explain who these third parties were that were requesting all these ministerial zoning orders to get these lands changed from agricultural to municipal and open for housing development.
I want to come back to the MZOs in a minute, but John, you had a thought?
Well, I think, Keith, to your point, the backroom deals language in politics is often used without substance. And now we have it. And we have a sleight of hand. And notwithstanding the fact that we have an election in 2026. So it's a while away. I mean, let's remember there's still new opposition leaders to come in and new personalities and a whole bunch of other things that can happen. People can leave politics, blah, blah, blah. This is something, I'd say two things. This is something that really is going to follow the government now, because it's not just on the Greenbelt and a sleight of hand behind the scenes to get more, where, you can picture the stogie smoking back room and all these people around it. So it's got substance to the visual. But the other thing that I think is that when I was in Ottawa for a couple of days, you do realize there how much of a bubble they're in. Like it's remarkable. And that's why when a government is in for a while, not so much immediately, but when they're in for a while, it takes a couple of days for them to respond. Even after that time, there's this thing of, we have to strategize and politicize everything and make sure that it is an issue to deal with before we deal with it. This is a clear and present danger. It is actually showing up in the polling for Doug Ford. And the more that this goes on, and the more that Ontario Place continues, and that I want to watch too, because as I said, I think things are going to shift over, and that has to be revealed, or it's also going to stick to the government, and he's got his changes potentially to come to it. That's going to be an important thing too. So I agree with Keith. I think backroom is there, but it's also there in a huge way with real substance.
So here's one of the things that I think is symptomatic of all the heat around the Greenbelt. To your point, yes, all of that, the backroom stuff, and I think those are issues. But when you start to look at some of the reporting, and I forgive me, I can't remember the reporter who wrote about it. It was one of the investigative team members at the Toronto Star. And they were talking about just the ministerial zoning orders. And Keith, you've got the property. You've got it. You've had it for a while. It all fits in. It's where it should be. We're going to be able to commercially develop it. It's got nothing to do with Greenbelt. But as soon as you get that MZO, the value of your property skyrockets, because we know now that it's going to shorten the period of time that you're going to be able to go in and develop it. And typically, based on the reporting, you don't even bother putting a shovel in the ground. You sell it to John.
You sell it, flip it. Oh, yeah. Right, you get that ministerial zoning order and you flip that property. That's what land speculators do.
Completely.
But in the old days, i.e. pre-Doug Ford in 2018, the previous Liberal government, I think the average was one ministerial zoning order a year. Very rarely used. It was a very special occasion, and a municipality would generally come in and say, hey, we've got this, we can get a new development here if we alter it. But, oh no. This government's handing them out like candy. Steve Clark, in particular, when he was the housing minister, they're just going left, right, and center all over the place. And it turns out they're all being requested by third parties who aren't being identified to us publicly. Mm-hmm. It's just, again, the stink of all this. And if you remember, the Integrity Commissioner said that Mr. Clark, who has stepped down as the housing minister, was to be reprimanded by the legislature. No signs of that. And when Mr. Calandra, the government house leader, was asked about it, he said, well, we tried to get you to pass a unanimous consent reprimanding him on day one. Yeah, on day one, that unanimous consent was a motion to reprimand Mr. Clark with no debate. No one could speak to it.
Right.
So come on, they're just playing these kind of games. Mr. Clark needs to be reprimanded by the legislature at some point, and that's going to happen, I would think, when that legislation comes in next week. There's going to be pushes to amend that to at least take some action against him for this. But the ministerial zoning orders, again, in combination with these boundary expansions in these other cities, this is just going to keep, there's just more and more to come out of this, and all of it looks like shady backroom deals. One of the opposition members tried to use the word corruption in the legislature this week. The speaker shot it down. But outside the legislature, that word's being bandied about an awful lot. And these are the types of deals that do look to most people like there's some sort of corruption. Somebody's getting something because of a backroom, closed-door deal that no one else knew about. It looks and smells horrible, and it's going to get worse, I think, before it gets better. And remember, that Highway 413, some of that's going to go through the Greenbelt as well.
Yep. I was just about to mention that. I mean, look, I think in politics you can have pure motives, and process can kill you. So if you're, and I'm not ascribing this to the Ford government, but you can say, look, we need housing. Let's get it done. Cut through the red tape. Let's, the bureaucrats are going to scream. We're going to have NIMBY all over the place. We're going to deal with this, but we need an expansion for housing. And we got to do it we got to move. So you can see a premier sitting in his office and a bunch of underlings and saying, I don't care what it takes. Just get it done, right? Okay, boom. And you go into the bureaucracy and you say, the premier wants it done. Boom, boom, boom. And you do all that. And then you say, yeah, but we also have to have a highway to get to all those places. And it's going to expand. And you can't say no. And I've said on this program before, I remember when we first came to the city in 1968 and we were at Esterbrook Avenue at the Don Mills Plaza and we were on the 11th floor. And if you looked north, there was nothing beyond Finch. So Markham was when we finally moved there in 1972, was still a farm town. And now it's like exploding. So expansion does move into the suburban area. And you are going to have all kinds of people who are going to clamor and clang against what you do. But the consequence in this is such that it has been in this era made with no transparency. And even the crosstown links issue that we have in the city of Toronto, where somebody's getting $800,000 a year and said, what is that? And a minister who really won't take them to task publicly and say, why is the wait going on here? The issue that's going to get this government, Ontario Place, crosstown, lands and things like that is backroom non-transparency. And as I said, if you're in the bubble, you don't see it. Like you're not reaching out beyond, and you may have pure motive, but the problem is your process is going to kill you. And this may stick to them for quite a while.
Well, and I was just about to use that word from the newsroom. The process stories are the hardest ones to tell.
Yeah.
It's the hardest one to gain any engagement with your audience or that becomes a challenge. So in the newsroom, everybody's all jazzed and excited about it because, man, have we got a great story. But you can tell that story. And Keith, I know you've been through this. I've been through this. You're onto a great thing and it's an important story, but there's a fatigue that builds in at some point. And I got to think that the Ford government's hoping just to sort of ride out some of that and let the fatigue set in.
I think they are. I think they do feel that, people do, let's face it. I mean, when you start getting really into the details, when you have to read a 16-minute story on the narwhal to really find out how bad things are, most people they get turned off by it. And that's when they start talking about the news is always negative and they don't want to get engaged with the news. And that's, It goes down another sort of rabbit hole. But of course, the end result is not helping anybody when that happens. I think it's very much easier for people to go point to something very specific. Here's one for you. Here's one that'll drive Ontario Place home. Mark Saunders got paid $171,000, and when the FOI
to do what?
They couldn't he didn't produce anything. He was to be the special advisor to the Premier Ford on Ontario Place. There's not a piece of paper. He produced nothing unless it was some verbal report. I guess, perhaps, That's the kind of stuff that people can get their heads around. We used to say, the $1 billion in the gas plants is just astronomical money. Give me $100 million. Give me $171,000. People can relate to that. He's getting paid 4 times what I make in a year to do what? To hold a placeholder till he could run for mayor and lose. It just looks terrible. And again, at least say some explanation for what was produced. These stories, though, it does have cumulative effects. And I'm convinced that Greenbelt 2.0 will, this continual nibbling away at this source, it'll turn some people off, but it'll embolden others and drive more people to go, you know what? The stink is not going away.
You know what? This is like the string on a wool sweater, right? And we've seen the cartoons, Bugs Bunny and all those guys where, the sweater is now up to the middle of the belly. It's being pulled away, and it's, the guy's just sitting there going, oh my goodness, having a cup of coffee, and yet it's being pulled away as every day. Again, I think if the RCMP in any way, shape, or form lays a charge in this, it's like lighting a fuse. I don't mean to mix metaphors with the sweater and that, but I think then it becomes so problematic where it's kind of like, okay, if it's there, is it there? Is it possible here and here and here? And this is what lack of transparency gets you. And I go back to the first term of this government when, we all remember how autocratic it was at Queen's Park, with Dean French sitting in the corner office calling the shots. This is different, but it's still in spirit, isn't it? It's just kind of like, we do what we want to do, and we think it's the right thing. It's going to have an outside perspective that guides them better than they have it right now.
I know the legislature's off next week, but I think there's still plenty to talk about. So why don't we save the whole conversation around the walk-in clinics for next Friday, because there is much to talk about there, and you talk about process kicking the government in the ass on that one. That's where it kind of falls down. But anyway, listen, guys, thanks for this. Enjoy your holiday weekend plans, and just not too much turkey, but whatever. Have a slumberous week after the big dinner. All right, that'll do it for us. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford with John Wright and Keith Leslie.
We've tried nothing, and we're all out of ideas.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.